Have you ever wondered what it's like to feel the walls of reality crack around you? To watch as something ancient and hungry slips through those fractures into our world? Sarah Chen thought she knew fear. She'd walked alone through dark parking garages, heard footsteps behind her on empty streets, felt that primal instinct that tells you to run. But nothing in her 28 years of life could have prepared her for what she discovered in the basement of the old Ashworth Manor that October.
What was that?
Sarah worked as a historical preservationist, the kind of person who saw beauty in decay, who could look at a crumbling Victorian mansion and envision its former glory. When the town council hired her to assess the Ashworth property for potential restoration, she was thrilled. The manor had stood empty since 1973, when the last surviving member of the Ashworth family, Eleanor Ashworth, disappeared without a trace. The locals whispered about it, sure, but Sarah dismissed their warnings as small-town superstition. She'd dealt with supposedly haunted buildings before. They were just old structures with settling foundations and overactive imaginations. The first day she arrived at the property, a cold Tuesday morning, when the autumn fog still clung to the ground like grasping fingers, Sarah felt a subtle wrongness she couldn't quite name. The manor loomed against the gray sky, its Victorian architecture still magnificent despite decades of neglect. Gabled roofs and ornate trim spoke of a time when the Ashworths were the wealthiest family in 3 counties. But something about the windows bothered her. They weren't just dark. They seemed to absorb light, as if the house itself was hollowing out the morning around it. She pushed through the front door, its hinges screaming in protest, and stepped into what had once been a grand foyer. Dust motes swirled in the thin beams of light that managed to penetrate the gloom. The air tasted stale and old, carrying the scent of rotted wood and something else, something organic and wrong that made her nose wrinkle. Sarah pulled out her flashlight and began her initial survey, noting the water damage on the ceiling, the buckled hardwood floors, the faded wallpaper peeling away like dead skin. For 3 days, she worked methodically through the upper floors, documenting every room, every crack in the plaster, every piece of surviving original detail. The house was a time capsule, frozen in 1973. Eleanor's belongings remained where she'd left them. A teacup sat on a side table in the library, a brown ring of decades-old tea staining its interior. A book lay open on a reading chair, its pages yellowed and brittle. Upstairs, Eleanor's bedroom held clothes, still hanging in the closet, shoes lined up by the door. A hairbrush on the vanity, with gray hairs still tangled in its bristles. It was as if the woman had simply vanished mid-routine, stepped out of existence between one moment and the next. But Sarah was a professional. She'd seen abandoned homes before, places where people had left in a hurry or never returned. It was sad but not unusual. What was unusual was the basement door. She found it on the 4th day, tucked behind what had once been a butler's pantry off the kitchen. Unlike every other door in the house, which had swollen with moisture and age, this one was sealed. Not locked. Sealed. Someone had used dozens of nails to pin heavy boards across the frame, then painted over everything in thick, industrial black paint. The paint job was crude and hasty, drips frozen in midnight cascades down the door and wall. Sarah stood there for a long time, flashlight beam fixed on that door, and felt something in her chest tighten. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to leave it alone, to mark it in her notes as inaccessible and move on. But that wasn't her job. She needed to assess the entire structure, including the foundation and basement. Besides, she told herself she was being ridiculous. It was just an old door. She returned the next morning with a crowbar and work gloves. The October sun seemed weaker that day, struggling to penetrate the clouds that had settled over the valley like a burial shroud. Inside the manor, the silence felt heavier, more oppressive. Sarah made her way to the basement door and wedged the crowbar under the first board. The nails shrieked as she pried them loose, the sound echoing through the empty house like a warning. She worked methodically, removing board after board, until finally the door stood clear. Her hand hesitated on the knob. The metal was ice cold, despite the relatively mild autumn weather. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could hear her own breathing suddenly loud in her ears. This is stupid, she thought. It's just a basement. But when she turned the knob and pulled the door open, a smell rolled out that nearly made her gag. It wasn't the musty odor of old houses, or even the sharp stink of mold. This was something ancient and rotten, like meat that had gone bad centuries ago, like earth from a grave that had been disturbed. The darkness beyond the door was absolute. Sarah's flashlight beam seemed to struggle against it, the light stretching down a steep wooden staircase that descended far deeper than any normal basement should go. She counted the steps as she went down. 20, 30, 40. The temperature dropped with each step until she could see her breath misting in the flashlight beam. The walls were bare stone, weeping with moisture, and the smell grew stronger, more oppressive, until it felt like a physical presence pressing against her face. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah found herself in a vast cellar that extended far beyond the footprint of the house above. The ceiling was vaulted stone, like something from a medieval church, and the space was divided by thick support columns that disappeared into shadow. Her light caught strange marks on the walls, symbols carved deep into the stone. They weren't random scratches or graffiti. These were deliberate, carefully executed, repeating patterns that seemed to twist and writhe at the edge of her vision. Then she saw the tables. 6 of them, arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the space. They were old operating tables, the kind you might see in a hospital from the early 1900s, but modified. Leather straps hung from the sides, their buckles dark with something that looked like rust, but probably wasn't. Above each table, suspended from the ceiling by chains, hung large glass vessels filled with a cloudy amber liquid. Inside each vessel floated something organic, something that had once been alive. Sarah stepped closer, her hand trembling as she raised the flashlight. The first vessel contained a human heart. She could see it clearly, perfectly preserved, the arteries and ventricles visible through the murky fluid. The second held a pair of lungs. The third, a liver. Her mind reeled as she moved from vessel to vessel, cataloging the organs floating in their chemical baths. 6 vessels, 6 organs. Together, they would have comprised most of a human being's vital anatomy. But the 7th table, the one at the far end of the circle, was different. It held no vessel above it. Instead, carved into the stone floor around, it was an elaborate pattern of symbols and lines, a complex geometric design that hurt to look at directly. At each point of the pattern sat a small clay bowl, and in each bowl were the desiccated remains of what Sarah realized were human fingers, 6 in each bowl. arranged like flower petals, her professional detachment shattered. Sarah stumbled backward, her breathing coming in rapid gasps. This wasn't a wine cellar or a root cellar or any normal basement space. This was a ritual chamber. The Ashworths hadn't been just wealthy eccentrics. They'd been practicing something down here, something that required human organs and elaborate ceremonies, and a level of dedication that spoke of true belief. She needed to leave, needed to call the police, tell them what she'd found, let them deal with whatever horror the Ashworth family had perpetrated. Sarah turned to run back to the stairs, and that's when her flashlight caught something that made her blood turn to ice. There, on the wall behind the 7th table, carved in letters 3 feet high, was a message The ofa ramanj mesti be kempiti, Tito mesti natiopin, Keiptecl. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the flashlight. The seal. The boards nailed across the basement door. Someone had sealed this place deliberately, had tried to keep whatever was down here from getting out. And she had just opened it. A sound echoed through the cellar, a wet sliding noise like something massive dragging itself across stone. Sarah froze, every muscle in her body locked in primal terror. The sound came again, closer now, from somewhere in the shadows beyond her flashlight's reach. She forced herself to move, forced her legs to carry her toward the stairs, but the darkness seemed to press against her, thick and resistant, as if the air itself had turned solid. Something moved in the periphery of her vision. Not something approaching, but something unfolding, like a flower blooming in reverse, darkness peeling away from more darkness to reveal shapes that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. Sarah's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Were those limbs? No, too many joints, bending in directions that physics shouldn't allow. Was that a face? No, faces didn't have mouths that went all the way through. She ran. Her flashlight beam bounced crazily as she pounded up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, her breath burning in her lungs. Behind her, the wet sliding sound intensified, accompanied now by a whisper that seemed to come from inside her own skull. The whisper spoke in a language she'd never heard but somehow understood, and it was calling her name, asking her to come back, to complete the offering that Eleanor Ashworth had started. Sarah burst through the basement door and slammed it behind her, her hands fumbling with the board she'd removed. But there were too many nails, and she didn't have time, because something was coming up the stairs. She could hear it, hear the heavy tread of appendages that numbered more than 2, hear the scrape of something sharp against stone. She abandoned the boards and ran through the house, crashing through the front door and into the pale October sunlight. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, didn't look back until she was behind the wheel with the engine running. Only then did she allow herself to glance at the house. Nothing pursued her. The manor stood silent and dark, its windows still drinking in the light. But now she understood what she was seeing. The house wasn't empty. It was full of something that had been waiting down there in the dark for 52 years, waiting for someone to break the seal, to open the door, to fail to complete whatever ritual the Ashworths had been performing. Sarah called the police from her car, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what she'd found. They said they'd send someone out, asked her to stay where she was, but she couldn't. She drove back to town, to the small motel where she'd been staying, and spent the rest of the day researching the Ashworth family on her laptop. What she found chilled her even more. The Ashworths hadn't just been wealthy. They'd been part of a secret society that dated back to colonial times, one that believed in opening doorways to what they called the spaces between. Their journals, preserved in the town's historical society archives, spoke of rituals and sacrifices, of attempts to bridge the gap between our world and something else. The last entry, written by Eleanor Ashworth herself just days before her disappearance, was barely coherent. The offering is incomplete. Father took his own life before we could finish. The door is opening anyway. I must seal it. I must go down and hold it closed. God forgive me. 2 police officers went to the manor that evening to investigate Sarah's report. They never came back. The sheriff organized a larger search the next day. They found the officers' cars parked outside, the front door standing open, the basement door unsealed. They found the ritual chamber, the preserved organs, the symbols carved into stone. What they didn't find was any trace of the 2 missing officers. No blood, no sign of struggle, nothing. They simply weren't there. The state police sealed the property, declared it a crime scene, and tried to keep the details out of the press. But in a small town, secrets don't keep. People started talking about the Ashworths again, about the old stories their grandparents told, about how the family had been trying to summon something, to make a deal with entities that existed in the cracks of reality, and about how Eleanor Ashworth had given herself to close the door they'd opened. Sarah left town 3 days after she opened that basement door. She couldn't stay, couldn't sleep without dreaming of that wet sliding sound, couldn't close her eyes without seeing shapes that defied geometry writhing in the darkness. She thought putting distance between herself and Ashworth Manor would help, thought she could leave whatever she'd unleashed behind. But here's the thing about opening doors that were meant to stay closed. Here's the thing about breaking seals that were written in blood and sacrifice. The entities that live in the spaces between, they're patient, they're hungry, and they remember who let them through. Sarah called me 2 weeks ago, her voice hollow and distant. She told me her story, told me about the sounds she hears in her apartment at night, about the shadows that move wrong in her peripheral vision, about the whispers that call her name in a language that shouldn't exist. She told me she's been researching, trying to find a way to reseal what she opened, to complete the offering that Eleanor Ashworth died trying to maintain. But mostly, she wanted to warn me. Warn anyone who might listen. Because the Ashworth Manor wasn't unique. There are other places like it, she said. Other families who made other deals, other seals that are weakening with time. And as those seals fail, as the barriers between our world and the spaces between grow thin, something is waking up. Something vast and ancient and unspeakably hungry. I haven't heard from Sarah in 4 days. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. I drove to her apartment yesterday. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was neat and orderly, as if she'd just stepped out for a moment. Except for the bedroom. The walls of her bedroom were covered in symbols. The same symbols she'd described from the basement of Ashworth Manor, carved deep into the drywall with what looked like fingernails. And in the center of the room, arranged in a careful circle, were 6 clay bowls. 5 of them were empty. The 6th contained a neat row of human fingers, arranged like flower petals, still wet with blood. Sarah's blood, I think. Her wedding ring glinted on one of them. I should have called the police right then. I should have run. But I found myself walking closer, drawn by a horrible fascination, and I saw what was written on the floor in the center of the circle, The ofefrim g mostbe compet. And beneath that, in fresher blood, I'm sorry. The police have her listed as missing now. They think she had a breakdown, hurt herself, wandered off. They're probably right. That's the logical explanation, the one that lets us sleep at night. But I know different. I know because I went back to Ashworth Manor last week, had to see for myself if what Sarah told me was true. The basement door was sealed again. New boards, fresh paint, but I could see something underneath. Dark stains that seeped through the wood like oil, like blood, like something that existed between the two. And if you pressed your ear against that door, if you listened carefully past the hammering of your own heart, you could hear it. That wet sliding sound. That whisper in a language that shouldn't exist. The thing is, there are 7 seats on the town council that authorized the investigation of Ashworth Manor. 7 people who signed off on sending Sarah into that house. 7 people who, in their civic duty and bureaucratic blindness, helped break a seal that had held for 52 years. 3 of them have disappeared in the last week. Just gone. Vanished from their homes and offices without a trace. The police are calling it a bizarre coincidence, possible foul play, maybe a serial kidnapper. They're investigating, interviewing, searching. But I know what's really happening. The offering must be complete. 7 organs in 7 vessels. 7 positions in whatever ritual the Ashworths started, and Eleanor died trying to stop. 7 people who unwittingly participated in opening the door. I was the 8th. I wasn't on the council, wasn't officially part of the investigation. But I encouraged Sarah to take the job, told her it would be great for her portfolio, brushed off her concerns when she mentioned the town's warnings. I helped open that door as surely as if I'd pulled the boards off myself. Last night, I heard the whisper for the first time. It came from the walls of my house, from the shadows in the corner of my room, from the space behind my thoughts. It called my name in that language I shouldn't understand but somehow do. And it told me that the offering was almost complete, that the door was almost open, that what has been waiting in the spaces between for aeons was finally coming through. I'm writing this down because someone needs to know what happened here, needs to understand what's coming. The Ashworth family tried to open a door to something beyond our comprehension. Eleanor spent her last moments trying to hold it closed, sacrificing herself to maintain a seal that she knew wouldn't last forever. Sarah broke that seal, and now she's gone, drawn into whatever darkness waits on the other side. 4 council members have vanished. 3 remain, and I can feel it calling to me, feel that pull toward the manor, toward the basement, toward the ritual chamber where the vessels wait and the final positions in the circle remain unfilled. Part of me wants to resist, to run, to put as much distance between myself and that cursed house as possible. But another part, a growing part, understands that running won't help. The door is opening whether I want it to or not. The entities in the spaces between have been patient, but their patience is ending. I know I'll go to the manor tonight. I know I'll walk down those stairs into that ritual chamber. I know because the whisper has shown me what waits if I don't, has given me glimpses of what will emerge when the door opens fully and nothing holds it back. What the Ashworths tried to summon wasn't a demon, or a ghost, or anything from our myths and legends. It was something older, something that existed before life crawled out of the primordial oceans, something that has watched our reality from the outside and hungered for a way in. The offering must be complete. Not to open the door, I understand now, but to close it. Eleanor Ashworth wasn't trying to summon something. She was trying to stop what her family had started, to seal a breach they'd created in their arrogance and ignorance. She failed, not because her sacrifice wasn't sufficient, but because she couldn't complete the ritual alone. It required 7, always 7 willing souls to stand in that circle and give themselves to seal the door permanently. Sarah understood this in the end. That's why she went back, why she prepared her portion of the offering. She's down there now, I think, trapped between worlds, holding back the darkness with whatever remnant of herself remains. The 3 council members who vanished are with her, I believe, drawn by that same inexorable pull. We'll all be together soon. All 7 of us, standing in that circle underground, our essence poured into those vessels, our sacrifice binding the door shut for good. Or at least, that's what I hope. That's what I choose to believe as I gather my courage for what comes next. Because the alternative, the possibility that we're not sealing the door, but feeding what waits beyond it, completing an offering that will finally give it the strength to push through into our world. That's too terrible to contemplate. But I can't stop wondering, can't stop the doubt that gnaws at the edges of my certainty. Eleanor Ashworth sealed that basement door from the outside. If she was part of the ritual, if she'd gone down to complete the offering and close the door, why would she have sealed it from outside? Unless she knew something we don't. Unless she understood that the only way to keep the door closed was to trap whatever was trying to come through, to keep it sealed in there with no way to complete the ritual, no way to gather the 7 souls it needed. And if that's true, if Eleanor spent her final moments ensuring that no one could enter that basement, could reach that ritual chamber, could become part of the offering, then what am I about to do by going back there? What are we all doing by answering that whisper, by following that pull? It's too late for these questions now. The sun is setting, and I can feel the call growing stronger, more insistent. My hands are writing these words, but my mind is already walking those stairs, already standing in that circle, already pouring itself into the waiting vessel. Whether we're sealing the door or opening it, whether we're heroes or victims or something in between, the ending is the same. The offering must be complete, and tonight, finally, after 52 years of waiting, it will be. If you're reading this, if I never came back from Ashworth Manor, then I hope we succeeded. I hope the door is sealed, the entities trapped, the barrier between our world and the spaces between restored. But if strange things start happening in your town, if you hear about places where people disappear, where shadows move wrong and whispers speak in impossible languages, then run. Run far and fast, and don't look back. Because we failed. The door is open. And what waited in the spaces between is finally home.